Okay. Mr. Alakbarov, yes, we're going to get started right now. And we have some audience here. And some more people will be coming in, but we'll get started now. So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We're very pleased to have with us today as our guest Ramiz Alakbarov, who, as you know, is the Deputy Special Representative and Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator for Afghanistan. He's joining us by video from Kabul to brief as we reach 1 year since the Taliban takeover in the Afghan capital. Mr. Alakbarov, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and I hope I'm audible from Kabul. First of all, thank you for gathering today and looking at the current situation where we have, of course, seen the 15th August, 1 year of the changes in Kabul. So what we can say about this, that throughout this year, the humanitarian actors, the UN agencies, humanitarian agencies, all partners who decided to stay and deliver in Afghanistan over this period of time have maintained probably the largest and the most unprecedented humanitarian lifeline delivery operation for the people of Afghanistan. More specifically, in that period of time, we have reached more than 22.9 million people, at least one form of humanitarian assistance, and we were able to provide this support in more than 401 all of the country's districts. And that represents quite an impressive reach out to the estimated 95% of the population which required assistance. Now, having said this, through the winter, which we crossed with generous support of the donors, the worst case scenario, which is the famine, a widespread famine in Afghanistan, was avoided. With the strong support of the health actors, the national health system was shouldered, and the hospitals maintained operationality, and the staff of the hospitals were paid. We provided targeted interventions to support the education sector, including providing the salaries for the teachers. It is regrettable that to the date, the schools for girls remain or above secondary level remains to be closed, and unfortunately 80% of the schoolgirls, 850,000 estimated out of 1.1 million in 2021, were not able to reach the schools. We could say that a lot has been done in terms of also supporting the ongoing humanitarian crisis related to floods and to the earthquakes. As you know, Afghanistan was stricken by a very, very difficult earthquake in the areas of Sera, Barmal, Gyan. UN has maintained a scaled operation to respond to this particular crisis. We also provided more than $1 billion in cash towards the relief operations. These are their essential payments made in cash by the United Nations towards the humanitarian causes and humanitarian operations in the country, but that also provided an additional beneficiary effect to the banking sector. All in all, we could say that throughout these interventions, the lives of millions of people of Afghans were saved, community education programs were supported, health outreach was sustained, and the worst case scenario was averted. I would like to say the generosity of our donors remains steady. We have received about $1.8 billion this year, and we consider it's a generous contribution. It, of course, is only 40% of what we asked from the overall requirement of $4.4 billion, leaving a gap of $2.6 billion. And right now, as we look at the situation in Afghanistan, as the result of the global food crisis, as the result of the economic decline, which is in place in the country, the price of the food basket is nearly 30% up, actually 29% up. And that requires an immediate and urgent attention. We are very grateful for all the contributions which were received Actually, I would say that 90 partners of the Central Emergency Relief Fund and of Afghanistan Humanitarian Fund projects. Sorry, there is interfering noise online. Yes, it's gone. So it is good to see that we actually have this strong community on the ground, but we need to have more resources, and they definitely need to continue to scale up. Overall, this year we will continue to have a situation where the 19 million people remain food insecure in Afghanistan, which is a reflection of the overall economic situation, reflection of the poverty levels, of the economic decline. And out of this amount, $6.6 million are the people who are in a IPC4 emergency level, which is very, very high level of food insecurity. Around 25 million people in Afghanistan today are living in poverty, which is up from 20 million in 2016. We have seen outbreaks of cholera. We have seen increased level of diseases, not just among the humans, but also among the animals. The situation with the livestock is also alarming. This country suffers from continued effects of climate change. There are floods which are taking place now as we speak in the southern regions. And this is just another effect of continued deforestation, land which has lost its ability to resist strong flows. And now we are facing this difficult situation in Jalalabad and in a few other provinces as of this evening. But that's a reflection of the impact of the climate change on the country. Moving forward, our humanitarian needs will continue to be large, but the humanitarian assistance alone is not enough. We need to be able to address the underlying causes of the vulnerabilities of Afghan people, which is obviously, I spoke about the climate change, but the fundamental driver is the poverty of the Afghan village, is the lack of development in the agrarian sector. Agro-food systems need to be restored, and the basic level jobs need to be created to provide a greater sustainability. Without functional markets, without operating banking sector, without investments in basic level jobs, we will not be able to reverse the trends which we are observing now in Afghanistan. We will not be able to bring people from surviving into a thriving mode. And right now, the attention is again on the need to provide humanitarian assistance, need to provide food, need to provide medicines, but we also need to consider how to move forward now 1 year on and how to deal with the chronic crisis and the chronic humanitarian issue in Afghanistan with limited development toolbox available. I will stop there, Farham, and we'll be very glad to answer any questions which may be asked. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. I'll open up the floor for questions. Just to let you know, there's been some audio difficulty, so we might sometimes need you to repeat some things, but we'll now turn to Edie Lederer.
Thank you very much on behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association. Welcome, and thank you for doing this briefing. My name is Edith Lederer from the Associated Press. A couple of questions. First, I believe you said that you've only received $1.8 billion of $4.4 billion that you've requested. What's going to happen if you don't get a significant amount more of the money that you needed, particularly as you're going into winter? And I wonder if you could tell us the status of the billions of dollars held by the U.S., some of it was supposed to be returned, but has anything happened, or is it still tied up in courts? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. The situation can be best described as a pure catastrophe because every time you go here into the hospitals and you visit them, and I just did a live on Sky News with an amazing coverage from the Kabul hospitals by journalists. It's a heartbreaking scenes. You have children malnourished, in dystrophical condition. The outcomes for them are going to be very negative. They will not survive this winter. Large groups of population in remote areas where the winter is harsh. Afghanistan has very harsh winters. The temperatures are very cold. And indeed, it can lead only to very negative consequences. The people of Afghanistan are known for their resilience and their ability to survive. Unfortunately, negative coping strategies for Afghanistan have been already quite seen. You've seen people selling organs. You've seen people selling children. This has been widely covered in the media. So this is what we will be seeing again if support is not provided. As far as we're looking at the winter and what's going to happen in a few months, Secretary General has made it very clear in his previous statements that frozen assets and frozen temperatures don't make good combinations. As far as the state of the current negotiations within the countries which have in their possession parts of the reserves, these negotiations are being conducted between the de facto authorities and the member states, and the United Nations is not a part of these negotiations. And as far as I know, there was no any outcome on the ongoing discussions in that respect. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the briefing. Just a quick follow-up to Edie's question. Can you put a number, an estimated number on like how many lives might be at stake throughout the winter?
We're talking about millions.
Hi, Mr. Alakbarov. Nice to talk to you again. This is Deji Xu with China Central Television. Two questions. First, follow up with Edith. Last week, more than 70 economists sent a letter to President Biden to urge release the frozen assets. Just want to know first, what's your stand? And second, would it make a difference if they release the asset? And second, I just want to know, since it's been a year that Taliban took office there, do you feel they're cooperative enough for your humanitarian work? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, I am aware about the letter which was sent, and it expresses the view of the group of very known and leading economists. From our sides, again, UN has been very clear about this issue. Definitely injection of cash into the economy and injection of financial resources into the economy of the country will cause a positive humanitarian outcomes, because the restoration of an economic activity will be very important for the country to recover and to create a condition that the people can feed themselves. However, we need to talk about a broader context of the economic recovery. For this, trade routes have to be functional. The banking system will need to be operational. International transactions will need to resume in order to facilitate the operations in the sector. And let's also be very frank, there is exemptions and licenses and many specific permissive environment decisions which have been adopted. So a lot of these delays are also related to the fact that there is a chilling effect. Even then, there are, let's say, exemptions, and if there are the possibilities for the private sector to operate normally, the decisions are also being made by the private businesses and the banks simply not to engage with Afghanistan. And this is called a chilling effect. So it's not necessarily that it is prohibited. It is just because the partners from outside of Afghanistan, just because it's Afghanistan and because of the nature of what is happening in Afghanistan, are not willing to engage more productively or within the existing permissive environment. So that's one element. The second, then, it comes to your question of how cooperative the de facto authorities of Afghanistan there. We can say that they've been very consistent in providing security guarantees. And we actually and we do have a consistent access to the entire territory of the country. When individual interferences take place, they largely take place at the decentralized level, and we are able to deconflict them. Overall, we were able to deliver the humanitarian assistance throughout the country. And whenever we faced restrictions or difficulties, we were able to resolve them through the means of discussions, negotiations, and clarifications. I hope that answers the questions you asked.
On the first question, I have a follow-up. So do you also urge the international community to, let's say, drop some of those sanctions for Afghan, or do you have any other suggestions on that?
As I said, we need to have these assets returned to Afghanistan. And I know that there are negotiations which are going on about those returns. And I know that the proposals have been made on the specific conditions, how, for instance, the private sector assets could be returned. So the flexibility needs to be exercised on both sides. But again, as United Nations, we are not part of these negotiations, and we are not aware of the details which are being discussed. So let's be very clear about that. It's a matter which is handled between the member states.
Kristen?
Hi, Kristen Salumi from Al Jazeera. You mentioned the need to address the underlying issues and release that funding for Afghanistan. Is there a way, if the United States is unwilling to give that money to the Taliban or give the Taliban control over that money, that the United Nations could apply it and address some of those underlying issues in your view? Thanks.
Can you clarify the issue? Sorry, the connection was not very... can you repeat your question? Connection was a bit choppy.
If the United States is unwilling to release that money to the Taliban or to the Taliban's control, is there a way that the UN could facilitate in helping address the underlying issues that you mentioned needed to be fixed in terms of agriculture and banking and so on? Could the UN assist in some way to get that money to the people of Afghanistan without it going to the Taliban? Is that possible in your view?
We have made a number of propositions to address some of the matters which you are talking about. One of it, for instance, was a proposed humanitarian exchange platform which we have offered to the de facto authorities of Afghanistan to serve as a platform for, let's say, private businesses to make the international banking transactions through a UN-facilitated and supported environment. That has been one of the offerings on the table for a long time. And inflexibility in these matters is one of the facts which we're facing, and it is related to the fact that sometimes probably there is not enough technical competence to understand what it is that they're offering. Or on the other hand, there is also a desire to maintain a very, very, let's say, stiff positions on where these matters are to be taken. Again, from within of the perspective of the United Nations, our key objective here is to provide humanitarian assistance and to facilitate humanitarian transactions. Whenever we are being approached by the member states or the de facto authorities of Afghanistan to facilitate one or the other matter, we do provide the suggestions on how this is to be addressed. However, these particular topics about the assets, about the banks, and other transactions are not explicitly referred to the United Nations, and we do not currently participate actively in the resolution of this crisis, except of providing the payments towards the legitimate humanitarian and basic human needs expenses in the country, and through actually providing a cash platform, which is basically shipping banknotes to the country. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you. Yes. Quick follow-up. Did you say it's 9 million food insecure? I couldn't understand the number very well.
It is 6.6 million, 6.6 million people, and this is an absolute highest number of people in this condition in any country in the world right now.
Is there a percentage?
Well, if you
I can do the math if I have to.
There's approximately 40 million people in Afghanistan, then 6.6 will make a proportion you can calculate it. Yeah.
Fethi?
Thank you very much, Ahmed Fathi, ATN News. When you said that the price of food have increased 30% in Afghanistan, to my best of my information, Afghanistan is predominantly an agricultural country. And according to the UN ODC, that during 2020, the production of heroin in Afghanistan was 590 tons, while in 2021, the same production was 650 tons of heroin produced. This is yielded from almost 450,000 acres. I don't understand how come a country which have vast areas suitable for agriculture does not have much trade with the outside world, the price of food would go exponentially, like 30% in 1 year. Do you have an explanation for that?
Yes, and I will gladly provide that. First of all, it's not 30, it's 29%, but it's almost the same. So the reasons for that are very simple. In the last 4 years, Afghanistan had 2 droughts in a row. 2 droughts in a row. During these droughts, the Afghan farmers have borrowed money towards their own survival against the future harvests. Moreover, they have sold out most of their livestock to survive these 2 droughts, the one of the last year and the one of the 2018. As you move forward from that place in space, currently there is a dramatic shortage of fertilizers and a dramatic shortage of pesticides, which has already impacted the harvest, even though the rainfall was relatively acceptable and the snowfall was relatively better this winter than the previous one. So as a result of it, I'll give you an example of my meeting with the farmers in the Parvan province. If they have a yield of, let's say, 500 tons of cereal or any other product from the territory they make, after they pay back for the debts which they have taken, and plus they pay out whatever is their dues, the amount which is left to the peasant or to the farmer to have for him herself is the 10% of that, which is 50 out of 500. This gives you an example of extreme indebtedness and poverty. Now, if you would go further and you say, yes, I agree with you, that the agricultural land of Afghanistan is in general fertile, but with very poor water management practices, with deep indebtedness, and with a total lack of infrastructure and mechanical production facilitation, such as machinery, or a storage of the harvest which is already collected, the situation is very difficult. They have no storage facilities to store harvest which they make, including simple things such as potatoes, onions. They're being sold to neighboring countries, and then a few months later they're stored, and a few months later the product are being brought back to the market and resold at 3 times the price. So the fundamental issue which we're dealing here with is not the quality of the land or availability of the labor force, but the fact that there is no infrastructure, there is no facilities for storaging, there is no fertilizers, there is no insecticides, and there is no mechanization. The fundamental requirement of Afghanistan is a huge change in agro-food systems, which would drive that village outside of the poverty. But investments for this area of work are not available right now. I hope I answered your question.
Thanks. Next question goes to Pam Falk from online.
Thank you very much for the briefing. It's Pamela Falk from CBS News. To the first question, you talked about a catastrophe. Could you be a little more specific? You've been very specific about food needs and medicine. What would you say is the priority that's driving Afghanistan to a catastrophe? Could you just give us some specifics? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So we need to reach a large amount of people, and this is not just, let's say, for the food. We are talking about, for instance, health sector. Health sector, the health needs and their uncovered needs we are talking about 11 million people. When we are talking about essential supplies such as, let's say, rehabilitation items for the displaced or the people who have been affected by the earthquake and they need the house to be repaired or displaced. We're talking about more than 2 million people. In the earthquake area alone, nearly 100,000 people will require assistance in terms of just providing for the requirements of the housing being rebuilt. So in education sector, we're talking about 500,000 people to be provided with just community-based emergency interventions just to keep people literate and keep them studying. Nutrition. Nutrition is another important area related, of course, to food, but that's where we provide an intensive nutrition to those children who are failing, and that's more than 1.2 million people. Protection needs, nearly 900,000 people. So the whole gamut of the 20 million people, which nearly 20 million people, 19,300,000, is coming up from the needs in various sectors. So this is overall level of vulnerability when we're talking about the needs. I answered your question.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thanks. And
Thank you.
and now we also have a question online from Benny Avni. Benny?
I'm sorry, Farhan. I wanted a question for you rather than to our guest.
Oh, in that case, you'll have to wait for my comrade Stefan Dujuric's part of the briefing, which will be right after this one.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Are there any further questions in the room for Mr. Alakbarov? Edie.
I'll ask one more question. There have been some concerns about the possible diversion of humanitarian aid to the Taliban and the quality of monitoring of where aid is going, particularly in many of the rural areas. Could you address that? Thank you.
Thank you very much. At this particular point in time, we have any financial transactions with the de facto authorities. And when it comes to aid distribution or provision aid directly to the population groups, there is very little space for this aid diversion to take place. Afghanistan is a high-risk operating environment. It has always been a high-risk operating environment, and it was so in the past as well. I would say that right now, most of the transactions are going either from major international institutions such as UN agencies and NGOs, and why the robust systems of third-party monitoring are also being put in place. So I would rather say that the application of know your client approach, of the third-party monitoring, and of the risk management approaches by the agencies which are delivering aid on the ground is rather robust. I have no reports of any aid diversion in my hands or which were brought to our attention, and we have quite an extensive surveillance systems and monitoring systems to detect such transactions. Of course, we are very much alert to any potential, and this is being taken very seriously at all levels, and corresponding relevant investments were made by all agencies making the transactions. When I go to the field, and I do that very often, and it is on my Twitter account and in my social media and on the UN websites, I take particular attention to see that every distribution site has independent monitoring. I have seen it functional, where every person who had benefited from assistance provided by the United Nations and its partner is actually being asked in a separate place by an independent monitor that anyone had actually approached or asked any favor or took anything back from them. So we are taking this very, very serious, and I would say that at this particular time, the probability of such an act always exists, but it's not very, very probable, because we're in a high-risk environment, but we're taking every mitigation measure possible, and it's being taken very, very seriously. I hope I answered your question.
Thanks, and I'd like to thank once again our guest, Ramiz Alakbarov, who is the Deputy Special Representative of the Secretary General for Afghanistan and the Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator. Thanks in particular for providing this briefing on what must be a fairly late evening for you, and I hope you have a great rest of your night.
Thank you very much, Farhan, and it's a pleasure. I'm always happy to speak about Afghanistan, and I would like to thank yourself and most of all our journalists for continuing keeping attention on Afghanistan these days. Afghanistan needs solidarity, and people of Afghanistan need our support these days. So it's great that we have such a great interest and support from international media. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Have a good night. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, we'll turn the floor over to our esteemed comrade Stefan Dujarric, who will provide the next part of the briefing. He should be here in any second.